Most people think of the 80s. They think of a time of campy music, weird slang, and corny TV shows. But many forget the social and political landscape of the time.
Okay. The 80s were a time of conservative resurgence, pushed back against beatniks, counterculture, a changing economy, and radical social change over the past few decades. You know, stuff like Roe v. Wade, the end of segregation, affirmative action, and the horrible advent of homosexuality no longer being classified as a mental illness, which, you know, come on, how could they have done this?
Enter Ronald Reagan, the little god of conservatism. Reagan promised to change America for the better. He promised to combat the inflation of the 70s that brought an end to the prosperity of the previous eras. His big message? The meat is the problem.
Reagan ran in and won on a campaign of appealing to the lack of trust in the government and happiness over loss of prosperity. And 3 things to note here. 1, it's important to remember that what happened in the 70s destroyed most Americans' trust in the government. You know, the Watergate happened, which did a number on the... Alright, moving on. Yeah, and Carter and Ford had really lackluster presidencies. Another noteworthy thing was that he was incredibly likable and he broke the New Deal coalition and took 50% of the blue-collar vote. And third, in April of 1980, a failed attempt to end the Iran hostage crisis took place. It killed 8 Americans and, once again, really damaged the presidency of Carter. Carter. And as a side note, those hostages were freed on the day Reagan was inaugurated, which really gave him a probably undeserved boost in popularity.
Reagan's solution to the economic crisis was to implement an economic policy called supply-side economics, or Reaganomics, or trickle-down, whatever you want to call it. Well, basically, the gist of it is this economic policy led in the belief that increasing taxes on the wealthy classes of America would increase free market activity while trickling down on the average citizen, mostly white people, through newly created jobs and wealth.
The Reagan administration saw a lot of early activity. They cut taxes, deregulated business, cut government spending, except for the military, and took a hard anti-union stance in line with Reaganomics and conservative thinking. Now, the policy of Reaganomics didn't really work in the long run. It was like Apush, good on paper, okay in practice at first, and then by the end you just hate yourself. The economy hit a low point in 1982 and started to bounce back in 1983. And the issue with this is it widened the gap between the prosperous upper class and basically everyone else. Combined with his military spending, Reagan's policies created a deficit, a huge one, and it changed the debate from what do we add to what do we get rid of and how much do we get rid of. There's, you know, we're still dealing with this deficit today. It was not a good thing.
Reagan's big victory in combating communism was invading the small island nation of Grenada, which was a communist base, which threatened national security. The invasion swiftly resulted in a U.S. victory, which helped swell nationalism and patriotic fervor. Another one of Reagan's acts of self-defense was to support the Contras in Nicaragua to overthrow the Marxist Sandinista government, which overthrew the previous U.S.-supported dictator in that country. The Contras became known for their brutal methods and numerous human rights violations, leading to the passage of the Boland Amendment, which prohibited further support for the Contras.
Which, you know, was pretty undude of them. Meanwhile, the government had a secret agreement with Iran to provide them anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles for their war against Iraq. Someone in Reagan administration had the wonderful, absolutely beautiful idea to use the profits from this to aid the Contras, which they were, you know, was illegal on 2 levels. So, congrats. Now, this move to fund the Contras violated congressional budget authority, and more importantly, violated the amendment where Congress basically said, you guys can't fund the Contras. So, yeah, that was very illegal. Now, Reagan was not personally implicated in this controversy, but he briefly took a hit in popularity because he came across as not detached, I feel like that's the wrong word. It wounded his popularity because, seems pretty hands-off and out of touch.
Moving on to America's favorite place in the world, the Middle East, the U.S. continued its policy of support for Israel. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to stop Palestinian Liberation Organization militants from raiding Israel. This resulted in a sharp increase of attacks on Israel from the PLO. The U.S. responded by increasing its military presence in the region after multiple suicide bombings, resulting in large amounts of casualties. Reagan pulled out of Lebanon in 1984. After this foreign policy failure, the U.S. took a different approach, pursuing a peace between Israel and Palestine. Some progress was made with this approach, and the PLO recognized Israel under U.S. pressure. In return, the PLO was granted control over the West Bank.
Now let's talk about the U.S.'s favorite foreign policy subject since 1945, Russia.
Yes.
More specifically, the Cold War. Reagan's arms buildup, which we previously at least mentioned, was meant to, pressure the Soviets, which is what we've been doing since 1945. Soviet deployed more missiles, and both of these just served to intensify the Cold War. And then Gorbachev. He became leader of the USSR and wanted to reform things. He attempted to end Soviet political repression and introduce free market practices, and a part of his reforms was ending the arms race. Because, buying a bunch of nuclear weapons really does not do your economy good. Reagan pushed for Gorbachev to be true to his reforms by tearing down the Berlin Wall, and they eventually agreed to destroy all of their intermediate-range missiles. Gorbachev began to pull Soviet troops in Afghanistan, and the USSR put pressure on Iran and Iraq to end their war. And then during the Bush administration in '89, Poland said screw communism, and then a bunch of Eastern Europe followed suit. So we did it guys.
We did it.
All us, it was all us. In any case, the Cold War was coming to an end, and within 3 years of Reagan leaving office, the Berlin Wall would fall, and then so would the USSR. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Of course, communism still existed. A good example is Cuba. And we can't forget Tiananmen Square when the Chinese government literally said, screw your pro-democratic forces, bang bang, you're all dead now.
Ouch.
That's a historian term.
Okay, alright.
Going back to Latin America, the U.S. attempted to correct its mistakes by invading Panama and removing General Manuel Noriega, a dictator previously supported by the U.S. U.S. soldiers remained in the country until a U.S.-approved government was established.
And that basically covers U.S. foreign policy. Now for the really fun part, American values, which is a phrase I dislike because American values is never one big monolithic thing. You will never get the country to agree on something wholeheartedly. It is impossible. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going with it. And the prevailing American values in the 80s were conservative. As a response to the liberal 60s and 70s, a bunch of religious feelings flared up, including the pro-life movement. The moral majority formed and financed conservative campaigns to unseat liberals, and religious fundamentalists pushed for prayers and creationisms to be taught in school. Really upholding those traditional constitutional values of separation of church and state.
Conservative Supreme Court justices appointed by Reagan also attacked Roe v. Wade by allowing restrictions on abortion by state.
Probably one of the most famous reform movements from the 80s was Reagan's war on drugs. America was in the midst of a crack epidemic, and Reagan obviously wanted to stop it. So the Partnership for Drug-Free America was created, and tons of PSAs were aired in the US. It's still something that's drilled into our heads from an early age. Winners don't do drugs, DARE, all that, don't smoke wacky tobacco, don't go in the white van, don't eat too much. It's one of those things that's just, every kid knows it. Like, don't stand too close to the TV. And a lot of these PSAs still persist in popular culture. Like, If I say this is your brain on drugs, you're probably thinking of eggs now. One of the most famous or infamous, depending on your viewpoint, anti-drug PSAs is Michael Jordan Talks About Drugs, sponsored by McDonald's.
Stop it. Get some help.
Beginning in the late 1970s, a new disease began to spread into America, mainly in male homosexual communities. This disease, called HIV, began to grow rapidly. The spread of this disease in the homosexual communities created a stigma that was a disease that only gay people could get. This resulted in numerous attacks on homosexuals, and also a delayed government response to the epidemic. It wasn't until 1985 that Reagan's administration started taking the disease seriously.
Multiple research organizations were created to, research and combat the HIV and also AIDS. And there was a lot of public stigma around the disease. In 1985, a Los Angeles Times study found that most Americans would prefer people with AIDS were quarantined, which, isn't depressing at all. I like to think that we've come a long way from that, but we still have a lot of problems with
Many of us like to look back on the 80s as a better time, but this era in history was much more problematic than we remember. Things such as the AIDS epidemic, U.S. foreign policy, wage stagnation, national deficit, or inequality are just some of the examples of many things we forget when we look back on this time period. These problems reflect our current issues today as well, but many of us failed to make the connection between our past mistakes and our current issues. We must reflect on the past and look deeper into our nation's history, or we'll be doomed to continue making our past mistakes over and over again.
The past is never really as rosy as we remember it, and we often forget that. Maybe it's time we stop letting politicians win us over with promises of returning us to some perceived better time and actually look forward to how we can improve.